Let's talk now to Dr. Charles Omole, Global Security Expert, Director General, Institute of Police and Security Policy Research, who joins us virtually. Good morning, Doctor. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
The situation is, as has been predicted, slowly becoming a grinding battle. All the dramatic movements that seem to have been seen in the first couple of weeks have since disappeared. Do you think perhaps it is time, especially because the Russians now say they are ready to sit down for negotiations, do you think it is possible that the Ukrainians too may also be thinking that perhaps it is time to once again sit down?
Well, I mean, this war was always going to end in negotiated settlement all along. Clearly, you need to be aware of the historical basis for Russia's position. The challenge Russia has is that I think it has used the wrong method to assert what some probably would say is a legitimate concern. Every global superpower we have, from China to US, even to European countries, everybody have what they call the sphere of influence, where what happens there affects them, even though those places are independent countries. We saw that, for example, in the 60s when the Soviet Union relocated some missile to Cuba. Cuba was an independent country. The America was willing to go to war, nuclear war if needed, because of that. So there's an element of hypocrisy in the way the West is perceived as dealing with or ignoring Russia concern. Because in 1991, when the Soviet Union broke into 15 different countries, Ukraine was the second largest country within the USSR. And if you look at the map of Eastern Europe today, every country that surrounds Russia, except Belarus, Ukraine, and Georgia, they're all members of NATO. So Russia is feeling kind of closed up by all these NATO countries, and NATO means American troops, American weapons can be stationed there. So all I think initially Russia was seeking was some form of buffer between Russia and NATO. And it saw Ukraine as the largest of the countries with 44 million people and massive landmass as being the best buffer between Russia and Europe. So but when the West continued their expansion into all those areas, Russia felt it had to act. And so what's happening now is, I feel the negotiated settlement will involve around recognition of Russia's hold on Crimea and some form of Russian influence in the Donbass region. That, I think, might be the roadmap to a solution.
Given the situation on ground, however, it does appear that the Russians, as you said, may have had genuine concerns, but they've gone about it with the wrong method. And one of the consequences of that wrong method is that both Sweden and Finland are now on the verge of joining NATO, although there is opposition to their joining from Turkey. Turkey, incidentally, was one of the peacemakers in the early stages of this war, trying to bring Ukraine and Russia together. They didn't exactly succeed with that. And they are opposed to Sweden and Finland joining NATO because of what they say are domestic security concerns that they have as well. So how do you see all of that playing in this? Many people expected that it was quite possible that Russia would go after both Sweden and Finland for attempting to join NATO. They had in fact said they would. And what they've done so far is that they've cut off gas supplies to Finland. Over the weekend, they did that on Saturday. And the reports are that Sweden is next. So how do you see all of that playing into this?
Well, I mean, you've nailed it. This actually is a problem. Also, when you hear NATO, people need to understand what was the origin of NATO. Why was NATO started? NATO started as a military, as a North Atlantic Treaty Alliance against the old Soviet Union. So NATO started as an anti-USSR organization. So fine, they might have modified slightly their focus, but the idea still, at least from Moscow's perspective, that is NATO is against us. So moving NATO assets to countries around Russia will make Russia feels very vulnerable and very jittery. And that, I think, is a problem. And I think what Russia probably will learn from this war in Ukraine is that what it could do in terms of the new countries trying to join will be more economic pressure rather than military action, because it's clear that the Russian military is not what it used to be. We can see that in Ukraine, how they've not really performed very well. So I don't think they will go for a new military offensive against those countries. They probably will use more softer economic and other pressure on those countries. But when it comes to Ukraine, though, that is a different kettle of fish. I don't think the Ukrainian border that was agreed in 1991 will ever remain sort of acceptable to Russia going forward.
Given that, let's look at it now, because when we were talking a bit earlier, when this war started in the first couple of weeks, there were those who said neither side was interested in peace because they wanted more military leverage from ground, and then they would come to the table. There are those who say that Russia is too strong. It is unlikely that Ukraine, even with all the help it is getting, will ever prevail against Russia. But that because of that help, Russia may also not prevail in any decisive fashion. So is there now wind? Is there wind, shall we say, towards some kind of accommodation, either along the lines you have already indicated, or perhaps with both sides giving up one thing or the other so that this war can stop or end?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, the way I see this is the fact that Russia's first attempt to, strike across Ukraine, I don't think, in my analysis, was due to the fact that they wanted to take over the entire country. I think it's much of a scorched earth policy. They just want to destroy the country. Russia's interest has always been the Donbas region, where they have more support on the ground. By the time you move towards the western side of Ukraine, support for Russia is in some places as little as 5% or less. Whereas if you go to Donbas region, you are seeing 60, sometimes 70% of the local people supporting Russia because they have more affinity with Russia. So that area has always been Russia's I think focus, but they expanded it initially just to, I think maybe just to punish Ukraine, just destroy things. In terms of whether there is enough military stalemate to bring everybody to the table, the answer is probably yes. But if you look at this, sometimes look at the performance and responses of the president of Ukraine. Prior to that invasion, all Russia was asking at some point was an assurance that you are not going to join NATO. And I'm 100% certain that any agreement to end this war will involve some form of hiatus to Ukraine joining NATO, because that would never be acceptable to Russia under Putin. So in a way, what could end the war is what could have prevented the war, which is Ukraine saying, okay, we are not joining NATO for now. And that probably could have prevented this. But the bellicose stance of the Ukrainian president being egged on by the West, I think was a bit too strong and discountenanced all the concerns of Russia completely. And I think right now, both parties probably are in that place where they can find a solution, but it will involve NATO pulling back on its expansion into Ukraine, I think.
Indeed, Dr. Charles Omole, thank you very much. Dr. Omole is the Director General of the Institute for Police and Security Policy Research. He joined us virtually from the nation's capital, Abuja. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you very much.
After the break, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says New Zealand is to offer more support in training Ukrainian forces. Please stay on with us.